Imagine. Imagine a tiger. Create in your mind the image of a tiger and try to see it in as much detail as you can. Let me help you out. On average, tigers grow to about 11 feet. They weigh roughly 600 pounds. Of the felines on planet Earth, they have the longest canine teeth, growing between 2.5 and 3 inches in length. They have stripes for camouflage. Now imagine you've just come face to face with a very unhappy tiger. Well, this is a challenge. Most of us don't have tigers around in daily life, so we tend to fall back on instincts: fight, flight, or freeze. Not great options. We're too slow to run away, not strong enough to fight, and probably not going to blend in enough to prevent the tiger from seeing us. So why did I pick a tiger? Humans emerged on Earth roughly 2.5 million years ago. The first Homo species, that is. Tigers arrived about 2 million years ago. How did we survive with such predators around us, with such threats in our environment? We're pretty frail in comparison to a tiger and other kinds of predators. So what competitive advantage allowed us to evolve? But let's suppose you live near a tiger. The tiger is no longer a surprise. Now you can decide what the problem is and what to do. Now you have time to get creative. And you can work with others. You can plan. You can build walls, create traps, weapons, and whatever happens, the tiger no longer has the advantage. You have the advantage. You see, this is what humans have always done. And notice there are two things going on here. We get creative, and we communicate and work together. And working together generally trumps individual creativity. Any shared plan about the tiger is better than no plan. So one of the reasons why we were successful in evolving was conformity. Let's look at conformity. Here's the classic study by Solomon Asch. Now imagine you are in this study. I'll describe it as if you're a participant. So a group of students are brought into a room. The researcher presents them with 4 lines. We'll label those lines A, B, C, and D. You're asked a very simple question. Which of the lines is the shortest? Each person is asked to report out loud the line he or she believes is the shortest. Now, you look at these lines and it's obvious to you that line C is the shortest, and in fact, it is the shortest. But what you don't know is that every other person in that room is working with the researcher. So as they respond to the researcher, before they get to you, each person before you says line A. Now, what do? Everyone else has said A, but you know line C is the shortest. Well, if you're like most people, in fact, 75% of the participants in this research study, you're likely to say line A. So how is this an advantage? Giving the wrong answer, going along with the crowd. There are benefits to conformity. Number one, conformity lends to collaboration, solving problems together. You have a woolly mammoth and you need to take it down, get some buddies. Second, it aids in learning. We observe others. We watch what they do. We pick up what works for them and then we use it ourselves. Third, it forms culture, as in accepted norms, practices, morals, and rituals. And finally, it saves us energy. Remember folding your arms? When we're conforming, we're in our comfort zone. So we save energy. We don't have to think about what we're doing. We simply continue to do what we're already comfortable with. But we know there's a downside to conformity. That if that's all we ever did, there'd be no change and little growth. So I would suggest that conformity and creativity, a necessary paradox, if you will, a necessary paradox in our evolution, that they had to work together. Let's examine this. Evolutionary psychologists say that we all have this internal tension between conformity and creativity, and that people will vary in terms of the strength of their conformity bias. For some, it's stronger. For others, less so. For those who are less likely to conform, they're more sensitive to the changing conditions of their environment, and as a result, they can spot opportunities. They're more likely to develop new solutions, adaptive responses to a changing environment. Now that's hugely valuable, but so is conformity, because as others see these new ideas, they learn, they replicate, they repeat, they imitate. And in this way, the ideas, these creative ideas, get spread. A new paradigm is created. And then guess what? The process repeats itself. So I believe creativity was an important partner alongside conformity in human evolution. Let's examine the case for this. If we look back through history, even to pre-humans, we can see problem solving. Pre-humans found objects such as sticks that they used for tools. Now with the first Homo species, Homo habilis, in about 2.5 million years ago, we had the first manufactured tool, the first purpose-built tool called the flake tool. Homo habilis had the brain size roughly 50% that of modern human. This tool, this flake tool created by Homo habilis, had a product life cycle of about 1 million years. Now we're going to skip a few human species and go to Homo erectus. They appeared about 1.8 million years ago, with the brain size roughly 75% of modern humans. They developed the hand axe. The hand axe took greater skill to create, manually and mentally. And the product life cycle for the hand axe was roughly 1 million years also. Flash forward, about 150,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared, the modern human. Creativity continued to expand slowly with the appearance of Homo sapiens, and then about 40,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. There was a creative explosion. Suddenly, there were throwing weapons, body decorations, and cave paintings, and burial rituals, and clothing, and shelter, and so forth. And as you can imagine, the product life cycle of these creative products was a lot shorter than the hand axe and the flake tool. So what conclusions can we draw from this quick review of evolution? First, I would suggest that creative thinking is a survival skill. Some call it creative problem solving. And that creative problem solving helped early humans in a very functional way to survive in hostile environments. But once we had that skill, once we had imagination, and as it grew, as humans evolved, that imagination grew to be applied in other ways. So it went from functional to aesthetic, from allowing us to survive to creating such things as art. And who knows, perhaps it's possible that art depicting large animals contributed in some way to our survival as well. Second conclusion from this review of evolution. Brain size and development correlated with creativity. As our brains developed, we were able to generate more complex products as our brains got larger. But humans don't have the biggest brains. That goes to elephants and some whales. So it's not just size that makes a difference. It's greater information processing capacity. You see, our brains have a high cell density in the cortex. plus higher conduction velocity and relatively smaller distances between neurons. That means we process information extremely efficiently. And it is this structure and analysis of the evolution of our brain that led Roth and Dick to conclude that humans are the most intelligent animal on our planet. Now, what's interesting is how they define intelligence. They define intelligence as the degree of mental or behavioral flexibility resulting in novel solutions. Sounds a lot like creativity to me. Mental flexibility, novel solutions. Here's the third conclusion from reviewing evolution. It's not just cognition, not just thinking that led to the creative explosion. We needed something else. We needed the right attitude. You see, we had the cognitive skills in place about 100,000 years ago, but we needed something else to enhance these thinking skills. And here we can look at play. When you look at the play of all mammals, their offspring engage in some form of play. This is true of all mammals. When you look at cats, for example, they stalk and they pounce and they wrestle. And this kind of play prepares them for survival later. And it's argued it's the same for humans. And when you look at human play, what kind of play do young children engage in? It's pretend play. It's supposition. This is crucial in our evolution. This developed an important attitude, the attitude of being able to suspend judgment, to believe that a banana, it could be a telephone. This allowed our imagination to roam freely. So I say, you were born to be creative. But many say, I'm not creative. When I tell people I teach creativity, I'm a professor of creativity, I study the science of creativity, often the immediate response is, I'm not creative. I think there are two reasons why people say that. First, we mix up a distinction that's made in the literature of creativity between two different kinds of creativity, special talent versus self-actualized creativity, or creativity in daily life. Sometimes it's referred to as big C versus little c creativity, or eminent superstar creativity versus everyday creativity. Everyday creativity is about reaching your creative potential. Creative problem solving used to address everyday life. Such as an example from when I was raising my children when they were young. My youngest son, Anthony, had a difficult time staying in bed. When he was a toddler, we would put him to bed and he would get out of bed and come downstairs, or he'd call out to us, and it really broke up our evening. It was fairly stressful. So I began to use my imagination. I began to actively, creatively solve this problem. And this is the solution that I came up with. It involved 3 pennies. I presented Anthony with 3 pennies. And I said, Anthony, it's fine. You can call us back into your room. But every time you do that, you have to give us a penny. You have to spend a penny. And when you've used up all 3 pennies, Mom and Dad can't come back anymore. Well, it worked like a charm. We'd put him to bed. I would give him his 3 pennies. And within a few minutes, he'd call out, I have a penny. And I'd come in and I'd spend a minute with him. That was part of the rule as well. Afterwards, after a minute, I would take the penny and I'd go away. And almost every night after that first penny, he'd fall asleep. You see, he didn't want to spend the other 2 pennies. He wanted to keep them in reserve. You see, when people say I'm not creative, it's often because they're comparing themselves to the superstar eminent creators. But here's the truth. The same thought process that we use for everyday creativity is what's used in big C creativity. Here's the second reason why I think people say they're not creative. We lose our imagination over time as we grow from children to adults. But it's something we can relearn. And we can turn to people like Edward de Bono. Some refer to Edward de Bono as the father of creativity. He's written many books on the subject. especially around and focused on applied creativity. He makes a distinction between vertical thinking and lateral thinking. Vertical thinking is when you dig the hole deeper. You follow one line of thought. Lateral thinking is when you move in a different direction. You go laterally. You dig different holes. So you're hunting for treasure. You're looking for a solution to a problem. One way to go about it is to dig the hole deeper and deeper and deeper, hoping that you find the treasure or your solution. The other way to go about this is to think laterally. You dig one hole. You don't find the treasure. You don't find your solution. You dig a second hole. And then you move laterally again and again and again until you find the treasure or you find your solution. Jokes work because of lateral thinking. When someone's telling a joke, they're moving you along a vertical line of thought. And when they get to the punchline, suddenly there's a lateral shift. So lateral thinking is the movement away from a pattern, like the major shifts in tools from flake tools to hand axe to the creative explosion. De Bono created a tool whimsically called PO, which stands for provocative operation. You see, our brain creates patterns. We build neural networks. This increases the speed of our thinking, which can make us very efficient thinkers, except when it comes to creativity. Creativity requires, in a way, slowing our thinking down, looking at unexplored pathways. In fact, highly divergent thinkers are more flexible in terms of how they use their neural pathways. They're less dense and less rigid. It allows them to meander, for their thoughts to cast a very wide net. Provocation encourages us to find a new pathway. It encourages playful thinking. Here's an analogy. If you were forced to take a different route from home to work, there's a detour, you're likely to discover new things because you're going on a new path, places that you hadn't seen before, restaurants that you hadn't seen. The mind works the same way. When we force our minds to take a new neural path, we discover new connections. So PO, this tool developed by De Bono, it's a made-up word like suppose, but it's deliberately silly and playful sounding. It indicates movement, a shift, a backing off of judgment. According to De Bono, he was inspired by the words hypothesis, possible, poetry, and suppose. So the way it works is you create a provocative statement. It can be even illogical. POs are created by exaggeration, wishful thinking. It can even be outrageous. Here are some examples of some PO statements. PO cups were made from ice. PO cars had square wheels. PO planes landed upside down. You create a PO and then you capture new ideas, new lines of thought that come from that provocation. PO planes land upside down. What might that suggest? Well, it might suggest moving the pilot. Here's an example from De Bono. They were working on an issue related to water pollution. And the PO that was created was PO, the factory, was downstream from itself. Well, that led to a new idea. The discharge from the plant would be upstream, intake downstream. This would lead to less pollution in that the plant wouldn't want to take in its own waste. Here's another PO. PO, schools had no teachers. What might that suggest? Well, the kids could be responsible for their own learning. Teachers might be replaced by project managers. You could have computer-assisted learning only. I want to encourage you to practice provocation. Try this PO tool. It will help you to get back to that playful, childlike way of thinking. Start with yourself, then try it out with the family and friends, and then perhaps try it at work. In the 21st century, many educational and business leaders put creativity, creative thinking, and creative problem solving at the top of the skills necessary for success. But do schools promote this kind of thinking? Or do they focus mainly on vertical thinking, helping you to learn to think like everyone else? Some would suggest that the schools are undermining creativity. It's a crucial skill. We're born with it. But there seems to be a creativity crisis in America. And there was a study done that provides some evidence to support this. A study using a measure of creativity. In fact, there are some 200 plus measures of creativity out in the field of creativity. This measure is called the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking. And it was used on nearly 300,000 students. And it was used over a long period of time, between 1974 and 2008, and across all grade levels from K to 12. And what it clearly showed was a creativity loss over time. Now let's look at the TTCT just briefly. How does this creativity measure work? Well, it possesses open-ended tasks, such as a product improvement. You're presented with a product and you're asked to think of other ways that this product might be made more interesting or fun to play with. There's also a visual format in which you're presented with figures, and you have to complete figures in an interesting way. Now, the TTCT is focused on divergent thinking. It's trying to measure divergence. Remember the predictor of survival for pilots and spies? Divergent thinking includes such skills as fluency, which is the ability to generate many responses when you're faced with a challenge. Flexibility, which is the ability to generate different kinds of responses, not just one single thought or many thoughts along one single track, but a diverse array of thoughts. Then you have originality, which is the ability to generate a response that's infrequent, that's novel, that others hadn't thought of. And then also elaboration, which is the ability to expound on one's thinking, to expand and describe a concept. Let's try it out. Pick an object in your environment, look around, and see how many different uses you can imagine for that object. Let me give you an example. A paperclip. A paperclip can hold papers, or it might be used as jewelry, an emergency clothes fastener, a tool to restart electronics, a temporary keychain, a lockpick, a scraping tool to create sculptures, to teach math, etc. That's a divergent thinking task. And the better you are at responding in numerous ways, in flexible ways, in original ways, and you being able to elaborate on your ideas, the greater your skill at divergent thinking. Hopefully you get the idea. For fun, you might want to try that out with a partner. Let's go back to the study. Fluency on tasks like this, when they looked at students over grade levels, they found that they increased in their ability to think fluently until third grade. And then it continuously dropped dramatically after fifth grade. When we look at the divergent thinking ability of originality, it too increased up to about fifth grade and then suddenly dropped significantly thereafter. Creative attitudes such as curiosity and open-mindedness followed the exact same path. I think this creates kind of a perfect storm. Creative thinking is considered a 21st century skill, seen as being crucial to be able to survive and be productive in times with rampant change. But perhaps education undermines it. Conformity pressures help to dilute it as well, and kids have less free time. In schools, Mark Runco, who's a researcher at the University of Georgia, working at the Torrance Center for Creative Thinking, says that schools primarily focus on convergent thinking and pay much less attention to divergent thinking. Again, I think this creates kind of a perfect storm. While this is a skill that's highly touted, it's rarely taught in schools. You might say, so what? Who cares? What's the big deal? Well, obviously, if you have children in schools, this might be a concern, or if you know children in schools. You see, the TTCT, the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking, is a predictor of adult success. People who score higher on the TTCT are more likely to be entrepreneurs, inventors, college presidents, authors, doctors, software developers. And get this, childhood creativity, measured by measures like the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking, are 3 times stronger predictors of lifetime creative achievement than childhood IQ. So what can you do to reinvigorate your imagination, or your children's, or your grandchildren? First thing you can do is identify what you or your child or your grandchild finds intrinsically interesting. What intrinsically motivates you or them, and then pursue it. Encourage divergent thinking and idea generation. Don't worry about whether answers are right or wrong. When they're doing art, whether it's good or bad. When they're playing music, whether it's being played well or not, if they're experimenting especially. Ask a child, ask yourself open-ended questions. What would you do? How might you? What else might you do? And use tools to encourage lateral thinking. Here's a creative thinking tool that promotes lateral thinking and can be used by adults and children. Edward de Bono created many lateral thinking tools. The one that he says is the easiest to apply is random word. It's literally using a random word to shift our thinking to solve a problem. It's important that the word be randomly selected. It forces new thinking because it kind of creates a provocation. Injecting a random word into our thinking requires thoughts to take a new neural pathway. Again, you must select the word randomly, as remote as possible to the challenge that you're working on. How? Well, you can use a dictionary or randomly select a word from a dictionary looking for a noun or a verb. There are random word generators on the web, and books like Thinker Toys also provide lists of random words. Here's an example. De Bono was working in a country that had a teacher shortage. They thought of the word tadpole, randomly selecting the word. That led to an image of teachers with tails. That suggested that each teacher have 2 apprentices to follow him or her around, taking on greater responsibility over time. In this way, they could relieve the pressure to find more teachers. I'd like you to practice lateral thinking. Develop this skill. In your guidebook, there are exercises on Poe and random word. Use these tools to force your brain to go down unexplored neural pathways. And remember, learning without application achieves the same end as ignorance. Try it out, and I'll see you next time.